Right, talking about incentives, I believe that it is the role of government as the key PPP partner to actually provide such incentives. Now, for you, what kind of incentives do you think the private sectors actually need to be part of this economic development plan?
Now, when I talk about incentives, it is kind of difficult to actually quantify incentives or even to measure it, because we were talking about political will, and then we are talking about different intentions of the key political actors. For instance, projects seem to survive in Nigeria only when they are within the 4-year political cycle. Yes, if you're an investor, if you're a project developer, you'll be okay with a project that lasts for 4 years, maybe housing projects, and we've seen some successful PPPs in housing because the period is just about 4 years or less than that. So anything outside 4 years or beyond 4 years or the political cycle, that begins to create some problem, because you cannot tell the plans or the intentions of the oncoming administration. They may renege on promises, they may cancel the contracts, and there is nothing you can do about that. I think the reason why that happens is that the legal framework isn't kind of insulated against such misnomers. So if there is any way, I think that's what needs to be done. The legal institution has to be redesigned and then ensured against such kind of sudden renegation of contracts.
And what other role does government have to play as a key partner in PPP to encourage the private sector, aside from the legal framework you've talked about?
Well, I think providing the incentives, some of the, what do we mean by incentives to the private sector? Again, I think it's a very complex thing. The reason why PPP is having, not only in Nigeria, PPP is having serious challenges all over the world. In India, too, PPPs have not quite survived. And then there was this report published in 2015 in the UK by a private sector initiative group, which says, I mean, the title of the topic is Why PPPs Fail. So it shows that PPPs have not really proved to be efficient in being the standing gap for government infrastructure provision. And the reason is obvious. Only the government has the capacity to do so much infrastructure. Even though it is being said in Nigeria that money is not a problem, but I think that money is a big problem. When we talk about $10 billion in infrastructure, and our government is right now in the market for $5.5 billion to fund the budget, that tells us that money is actually an issue here. So, yes, the funding is a very big problem. Now, how does government create incentive to the private sector? I think the legal framework is key here. Giving them the assurance that their money is safe and they can recapture. But then there is a dilemma, because the more they play to the interests of the incentive of the private sector, the more they veer off the interests of ordinary citizens, who may begin to see a situation where the government and the private players, the top people in the economy, seem to have gone into some kind of partnership against them, and then usually they will kick against that. As we see this morning, the airport workers are marching against the government because of the plan to concession the airport. So we see this all the time.
Now, are there other lessons? Are there lessons to learn from other developed economies? Sorry.
Even when we look at the historical record of PPPs, the UK started the PPPs, PFIs, Private Finance Initiative. That worked for until a point in time. I think the financial crisis actually led the UK to pull back on that. So there has been a kind of a checkered history when it comes to PPPs, even in the United States. So, because it involves project finance, it has not been so successful the world over. I think the real problem here is because we haven't quite understood the intricacies involved. And that is why where the Lagos Business School has stepped in. We have a center, which I talk about all the time, CIPRA, where we partner with we work with private sector organizations involved with PPPs. We work with stakeholders, with the government, trying to understand some of these complexities, put them to the lab to see if we can find ways, to ameliorate some of these difficulties and inherent risks in PPPs. That is still an ongoing project. I think we really need to ramp up our efforts in learning more, studying more, building more competencies on PPP designing and PPP management in Nigeria.
Now, what model of PPP do you think can actually work in Nigeria?
Well, there are so many models of PPPs. It depends on the infrastructure in question. For instance, in the airport, concession seems to be the PPP model that works. When you have different models of PPP, you can have leases, you can have franchises, you have concessions. Under concessions, you can have a build, operate, and transfer. Sometimes you have a build, own, operate. There are so many types. It depends on the infrastructure in question. So there is no single model PPP for every sector. It depends on which sector. Some sectors, it is BOT. Some sectors, it is just a concession. For some, it could be lease contracts. For instance, we had the management contract that was given to Manitoba over TCN, the remnant of Nigeria's power privatized entities. And then that was for 2 years. So that is what is good for that. Then when it comes to ports, I think what works in ports is concession. Then in terms of roads, we have a situation, if it's a toll road, it's supposed to be a BOT. So the private sector builds and then operates, collect the tolls, and then over the period, maybe 25, 30 years, they hand over the assets to the government. So it depends on the infrastructure in question.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Bongo Adi. That's where we'll leave that conversation for now, but it's an ongoing conversation, so we'll keep talking about that. Thank you very much for your time. Dr. Bongo Adi is a faculty member at the Lagos Business School. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll look at today's trading activities at the equities market. Do stay with us.